Hi YouTube, this is Evie. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. This time I'm going to be talking about the differences and similarities between a DDLG lifestyle or DDLG dynamic and Petplay or Petplay lifestyle, and how those two types of play and those two types of BDSM are both similar and different. I'm going to be doing a follow-up video probably next week where I talk specifically about people who combine the two headspaces and people who are both at the same time, or people who both have DDLG as part of their relationship and Petplay as part of their relationship concurrently, and how that kind of works out and my opinions about it and everything. So I will link that down below when it's ready for you all to watch. But hopefully you do enjoy this video. First, I'm going to be going over the similarities, and then I will be talking about the differences. The reason why I wanted to make this video is basically because I have noticed that even though traditionally in BDSM, I think Petplay and DDLG are two very different lifestyles and they're two very different ways of doing BDSM, as Petplay and DDLG have both gotten more popular, gotten more media attention, especially on places like, I notice, any kind of social media. They have kind of merged together closer and closer and become more and more similar, because the groups that are participating in DDLG and Petplay and Kitten Play specifically on places like Tumblr and Instagram are all like females under the age of 25, and they have a very specific way of doing Petplay and they have a very specific way of doing DDLG. So the two can seem very similar, and I kind of just want to talk about that and see how they're different and how they're the same, because a lot of people get kind of confused about if they're a little or a pet, or if they are more little or more pet in their relationship, and how to kind of tell the difference between the two or keep those two spaces separate. So hopefully you found this, video informative, and I will just go ahead and get started. DDLG and Petplay share a lot of similarities for one main reason, and that is the caregiver aspect that both of these can share. I think traditionally in Petplay, that was not so much the case because it was more focused in humiliation and degradation than it was in caregiving, but it's always been a very big element in DDLG. The sense of being taken care of, the sense of having somebody who looks after you, who cherishes you. And I think the way that we care for children and the way that we care for our pets can be very similar depending on the kind of owner you are. There's a reason why people have fur babies and why people are pet parents. It's become very common to treat your pet in the same way that you treat your children. And so for that reason, Petplay and DDLG can be very similar, because people are looking at the way that people treat their pets and the way that they treat their own pets and incorporating that into their BDSM dynamics. A lot of people engage in Petplay and they engage in DDLG for that caregiver aspect, and that totally makes sense because it does feel really good to have that relationship you can come home to after a long day at school, after a long day at work, and have that person who really does have your best interest at heart, to make sure that you are doing everything you're supposed to do, making sure you have all of that self-care in place that you need to have in order to function as a healthy, complete adult human being. I think that's another very similar element between Petplay and DDLG, is the desire to not be an adult all the time, because it is very stressful to be an adult, whether you're still in college or you have a full-time job or you're working two part-time jobs or you're unemployed or whatever your situation happens to be. Just being independent and responsible is so stressful, and it's such a relief to be able to come home and sort of shed that skin of being an adult and not have to worry about adult things, not having to worry about putting gas in your car or paying taxes, or what you're going to do at work the next day. Such a big relief to either come home and, put your collar on and sit in front of the fireplace with your dominant while he plays video games and getting out a coloring book, or laying at your dom's feet and playing fetch for a while, or just snuggling. Like, both of those things, very relaxing and very calming, and they both share that element of not being an adult, of not being that same person you are in your day-to-day life. And I think that's sort of a common thread throughout all of BDSM, is sort of not being yourself, or being a different part of yourself you can't show the outer world. But I think it's most pronounced in DDLG and Petplay, because you are taking on a different age in the sense of DDLG, although not everybody who does DDLG regresses in age or acts at a different age. Just sort of having that childlike wonder in general that maybe you don't get to express in your everyday adult life, or being an animal and not having any human worries at all and just relying on somebody to be able to take care of you. That the two share is having rules and having structure and having a freedom in a schedule, if that makes sense. So, like, for example, if you are a pet, you know that you're going to get walked, you're going to get brushed, you're going to get taken care of, you're going to get fed at a certain time, you're going to have, grooming at a certain time, whatever it is. And with DDLG, you can have a lot of those very similar things. So, your dinner is going to be prepared at a certain time, you have bedtime at a certain time, you're expected to brush your teeth and get ready for bed at a certain time, all of that kind of stuff. So having structure and having rules, I think, is helpful for a lot of submissives, again, in general, throughout all of BDSM, but it is particularly pronounced when you're giving up so much power to another person. The level of power exchange, I think, between DDLG and Petplay can be very similar. So the way in which you give up power and the type of person you are trusting that power with can be very similar between DDLG and Petplay, because a pet, especially a young child, have very similar ability to communicate and a very similar way to express their needs. So let's say if you're playing as a 3-year-old and you're playing as a dog, a child is going to express their needs by crying, by whining, by going, "Daddy," or "Mommy," or whoever, caregiver, whatever it is. And a dog is going to bark. They're going to whine. They're going to crawl. They're going to, scratch at the door. They're going to do very basic kind of communication. Whereas if you are playing as an adult or you're just being your everyday adult self, the level of communication you're expected to have, in scene is very different. And something else that makes DDLG and Petplay really similar is actually just the fun of it. Like, a lot of times in BDSM, things are very, serious and regimented, and you will obey my slave, kind of things. And you can totally do that with DDLG and Petplay, and that kind of play is awesome in its own way. But I think DDLG and Petplay specifically, at least the way that I've seen it done very oftentimes, is it has a very unique take on a BDSM relationship, because it is very playful and very fun and very genuine for a lot of people. I'll talk about that more in a second, but just being able to just sit down and color or watch TV shows, or being kind of uh, overtly like a little kid, just being why, like doing that kind of thing, and just kind of being playful and silly and fun. It's something that you don't really get at a lot of other types of BDSM, and you get that with DDLG and Petplay, because it just tends to be less serious in general. I think that's a very unique and a very interesting shared aspect. I think something else that the two share is a lot of people, it's not just about doing it in a scene. Like, when you do something like impact play, for example, people don't tend to use it as a personal identifier. Like, when you introduce yourself to somebody, you don't say "I am an impact bottom." Of course, depending on the context, you may totally do that, but people don't tend to think of themselves as "I am an impact bottom" on their list of self descriptors, and they don't tend to internalize it as much as you get with both Petplay and DDLG. Being a little or being a pet for a lot of people, or both, if it happens to be that way for that particular person, is a very near and dear thing to a lot of people's hearts. They are a little, on the inside, that is what they are. They are a pet on the inside. That is who they are as a person, and they cannot imagine a relationship that they would genuinely enjoy and feel fulfilled with if they were not able to be a little, or they were not able to be a pet with this person. And it can cause a lot of issues with relationships, as they aren't able to express themselves properly as a pet or as a little. And I'm sure there are a million other ways and a million other reasons why Petplay and DDLG are similar, but I don't want this video to be an hour long, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Of course, feel free to leave in the comments down below some other reasons why you think Petplay and DDLG are similar, or why the two are similar to you personally. But I am going to start talking about the differences between DDLG and Petplay. I think one of the most obvious reasons as to why Petplay and DDLG are different is the way the two started and the way the two communities form and interact. Like there's definitely a very specific like DDLG community, and there's a very specific Petplay community. And there's people who are in both, there's people who overlap, but I think they purposely try to keep themselves very separate because they come from very different origins. Whereas Petplay is very much humiliation and degradation focused, at least in a very like traditional sense. You don't really have that in DDLG or being little. I think there are types of play, like for example wearing diapers or not being allowed to cut your own food or things like that. There are elements of DDLG that I think can be very humiliating, very degrading, and there's totally people who incorporate that into their DDLG, but I think it is far less common than what you would see in Petplay. I think sort of the main theme around the two types of play are very different, even if for a specific person, the reasons behind those two types of play can be very similar. By and large, the two are very different. And I think what people see as the stereotypical pet and the stereotypical little are two very, very different things, and they're two very like different archetypes. So, for example, when I think of a stereotypical little, I think of somebody who has a daddy or wants a daddy who engages in very like stereotypical behaviors for, let's say, like a 5-year-old girl or something like that. Let's say they wear lots of dresses, they wear frilly colors, they wear the color pink a lot, they like Hello Kitty, they do stuff like that. They do things like color, they watch cartoons, they have like hot dogs that are cut up into little octopuses for dinner, they drink out of a bottle or use a binky, they wear diapers, things like that. Just overall, that is sort of what I picture a little to be, or somebody who participates in DDLG to be, and that is a stereotypical image. I'm aware there are issues with my particular image of a stereotypical little, but that is just what pops into my head as accurately as I can describe it when I think of DDLG, even if it is extremely stereotypical. Whereas when I think of a pet, I think of a very different person. I think of a very different submissive. I think of somebody being not able to use the furniture. I think of somebody who's only allowed to eat off of the floor. I think of somebody who sleeps in a cage at night. I think of somebody who has a very different relationship with their dominant. I find in DDLG it's a lot more common to see topping from the bottom, and there's a lot more common to have a very like bratty sort of aspect to your relationship. And Petplay, at least the way that I conceive of it, and there are definitely people who do Petplay totally different than I do, it's a very loyal and devoted type of play. It's about wanting to please your owner and your master. And in DDLG, you can totally have that as well, but I feel like it's more of a bratty wanting to please rather than like a genuine desire as an animal to be able to be good and be rewarded for being good. I think of somebody who, you know, maybe is a leather puppy and they're wearing like very traditional leather bondage, they're wearing a leather hood, they have paw mints on. The type of gear that the two types of the players wear can be very different, although again, because of Instagram and Tumblr and these sort of overlap between the two, the kinds of gear that the two groups wear can be very similar, and increasingly that is the case. But traditionally, the way I conceive of it, very different outfits, very different ways of interacting with your dominant, even if sort of at the core traditionally they're very different. They're increasingly similar, but again, I'm thinking of stereotypically, traditionally, what I think of Petplay and what I think of DDLG. And depending on your specific relationship, the way that punishment and rules are handled, and the types of rules and the types of punishment that you get can either be very different or very similar. So for example, you could have something like corner time, which I think is a very like DDLG specific kind of punishment, whereas with a pet you could be squirted with a water gun. And that's not something I necessarily see like changing. Like I don't see a pet getting corner time. Maybe they would get locked in a cage or something like that, but I don't necessarily think they would have to do something like write lines, because that is something that is very related to DDLG and being a child, and especially being in school. If you're playing as a school-aged person in your DDLG relationship. Whereas I don't see somebody squirting their kid with a water gun unless they're just like a really bizarre parent. Like I don't see a lot of overlap happening with that specifically. And I think the two headspaces, at least for me personally, very, very different. I think of me in childhood and like me behaving like my 5-year-old self or behaving like a stereotypical 5-year-old to be a very different experience from behaving like a pet. I would definitely not act the same way between those two headspaces, although again, for some people, they overlap, they're similar, that makes sense for them. But I think in general, the headspaces between the two, very different, very different ways of interacting with the world in general. And I think it's more common in pet play to have things like restricted speech and restricted furniture access, where I really don't see that happening necessarily in a DDLG relationship. The types of scenes that you would do as somebody in a DDLG relationship and in a pet play relationship can be very different as well. Again, I'm going to say it for like the 50th time in this video, there can be overlap. There are people who do very similar scenes for both pet play and for DDLG if they engage in both. But for me personally, I conceive of the two very differently. Like, I cannot imagine somebody in DDLG doing like a takedown and capture scene pretending they're being caught by animal control. Like, that is very specifically something I think that would happen in pet play. I think impact play, way more common in DDLG than it is in pet play. Of course, it depends on the kind of pet play you're playing and the kind of scene that you're having, but I don't really think people go around spanking their dogs the way that people engage in spanking in DDLG. Do not see that happening. I think the way that the two groups engage in bondage is very different. So, for example, I've talked about this before, but in pet play you can have something called crawler gear, which is where you are forced to walk on your knees and elbows, and very often you also have your hair pulled up so that way your head is forced up as well. It's very restrictive, and it is very like forced kind of movement, and I don't see something like forced crawling really happening in a DDLG scene or like in the context of a DDLG relationship happening either. And I think the kinds of scenes that pet players and DDLG people engage in fundamentally are very different. Like, a lot of times in DDLG scenes, at least from what I know, I am not in DDLG, so I could be completely wrong about this, but it seems very oftentimes scenes start off with somebody being bratty, and generally a lot of times they're very masochistic. So they're being bratty in order to obtain pain, in order to obtain that hurt that they desire. And that can either result in something like a spanking or flogging that could result in being put in the corner and being ignored. It can have a lot of different implications, but generally it's more about being bratty, then receive punishment. Punishment equals scene, because you're doing a punishment. You're not really like being punished for breaking the rule. It's more a way of negotiating for the start of the scene. Whereas with pet play, you have things like trick training, finding treats, going on walks, being put in a cage, being, captured and dragged away, just generally like being close to your dominant, things like that. The way you negotiate and start a scene and the makeup of the scene is very different, because I don't generally see it focused around bratting and then obtaining the pain that you need for masochism. And this is not to say that everybody who participates in DDLG is a masochist or is a brat or anything like that. I just think a very common thread in DDLG that makes it different from a lot of people who participate in pet play is the desire for pain and the desire for things like spanking or being, reprimanded in general in a physical way, because I don't generally see that happening in pet play nearly to the same level that I do in DDLG, at least in the examples that I have seen. But that is really all I have to say about this particular subject. I could probably go on and on and on and make a whole other, 40 minutes worth of video just in this particular subject, because it is so vast and there's so much that I could cover. But this is really where I'm going to wrap it up. So hopefully you guys found this video helpful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. You can leave any questions or comments down below. I would love to know, just for general purposes, what you guys think of the differences and similarities between DDLG and pet play are, or how you personally incorporate both pet play and DDLG into your relationships. Are they separate? Do you combine the two headspaces? If you do, it's something you do very often, or is it rarely? Can it be confusing to tell the difference between your pet space and your little space? Would totally love to know more. If you guys haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel, because I do make videos twice a week. You can find links to my social media in the description down below, as well as links to all of the resources and what research I did for this particular topic. If you like this content and you want to support this channel, please also consider going to my Patreon, which you can find in the description down below. But until I see you next time, have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.